Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Science Pub, where the top minds at Oregon State University share their passions in work and research with our community members. This is Nathan Moses, Assistant Director for Events and Engagement at OSU-Cascades, coming to you from YouTube land, and I thank you for joining us tonight. OSU-Cascades' own Ryan Reese will be presenting on EcoWellness, optimizing time outdoors, in just a short while. But first, let's get to our announcements. First up event is the Connections event. So brand new, OSU Connections is now live and open to all alumni. This is your new online professional and social network tool to connect with others in Beaver Nation, share advice and stories, find jobs, volunteer, and more. Check us out at osUconnections.org. The Stone Award, we've been updating this one over the last couple events, but there is the update regarding the date and time. So the Stone Award for Literacy Achievement that we've been promoting is going to be now at 5 p.m. on Thursday, April 29th. Those of you that have already registered may have already received that update. Those of you that have not, please feel free to check out the registration at beav.es/JYK. I'm also listed here on the screen if you're interested in attending. And finally, upcoming Science Pubs. We will kick off May with a conversation with Bryson Robertson about wave energy on May 10th. Rounding out the academic year, we're going to have John Parmigiani with a dive into OSU's prototype development laboratory on May 25th. And again, OSU Cascades' own Matt Orr bringing his research on gut ecosystems and relevance to human health on the evening of June 7th. All Science Pubs through spring of 2021 will live right here on this YouTube channel at 6 p.m. All right, so Mentimeter. Old hat now at this point, everybody, but those of you that have participated with us before are quite familiar with how Mentimeter works. This is our primary question and answer feedback tool for our presenters. So again, those of you that are new, you're going to go to the Mentimeter app. You can take a screenshot of this QR code listed right here during the presentation, or open your browser to www.menti.com. We're going to use event code tonight, 86920470. That's 86920470. A little bit different tonight. We are going to forego the quiz, and some of you may remember during your registration we asked you a prompt, and that prompt was to consider the most meaningful experience you've had in nature. What made that experience impactful for you, and what emotions emerge as you recall it now? What we would like is for any of our guests that are joining us directly through YouTube, jump into Mentimeter, take some time to reflect on that a little bit before Ryan gets to this part of his presentation, just to do a little bit of reflection on this prompt. The prompt will show up in your Mentimeter app, so feel free, put those submissions in. We're going to select a couple of them as we get into the presentation, but feel free and reflect a little bit on that prompt before we get going tonight. And again, we will use Mentimeter later in the presentation as the question answer portal for all your great questions that you ask every single event that we have. So thank you in advance for that. All right, to get us started, we're going to go ahead and jump right into introducing Ryan. So Ryan Reese is an assistant professor of counseling at Oregon State University Cascades. He recently received the Humanistic Advocacy and Social Justice Award from the Association for Humanistic Counseling. In 2018, he was recognized by the Western Association for Counselor Education and Supervision for research contributions to the counseling field. He was named a Trillion Keep Oregon Well Mental Health Hero in 2017. First off, again, as we always do, thank you so much for your time and expertise, Ryan, and I will let you take this away, my friend. Now we got to get you unmuted, buddy. No worries, no worries. Ryan, sorry, man. It's still muted. It's okay. Technical things happen.
Sorry about that.
There you go. No worries.
Now? All right. Excellent. Excellent. I'll share this again here. So thanks for having me tonight. I'm thrilled to be here and really excited to share a bit about EcoWellness and a small slice of the pie that that I'm familiar with when it comes to kind of the human nature connection and wellness and how it enters into the counseling world a little bit. Before jumping into that, I want to share just a bit about our counseling program and pitch that just a little bit. So like I say, I'm an assistant professor in the counseling program at OSU-Cascades. We have 2 nationally accredited tracks in our school counseling and our clinical mental health counseling major options. We have both full-time and part-time options available to students. So if that's something that you're interested in or could be interested in, or if you know somebody who might, certainly pass on the word. And also, I think above all else, I just wanted to share about our free community counseling clinic. And I put the web link there as well. So if you or someone you know might benefit from free counseling services, please check that out. But let's go ahead and transition into our reflection prompt. I was able to check out some of the responses that folks had already shared prior to tonight. And I'm curious to kind of hear maybe a few that folks are sharing now. So Nathan, I'll let you maybe share a couple that you're seeing come across.
We haven't gotten it yet, but I do know that we had a number of folks that have already submitted. So even if you already submitted through the registration portal, why don't you pop it in Mentimeter if you've got? If not, Ryan, we could probably just kind of go forward with some of the observations and things that you saw during all the great responses we got during the registration.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll just speak to some kind of themes that I saw emerge with some of the more meaningful experiences. There was 1 or 2 comments around, well, does meaningful include magical? In terms of just sort of the impactful and sort of transcendent experiences that can occur within nature. And I think that was definitely a key theme throughout a lot of the 26 responses that I really observed, was sort of just the spiritual connection and experience, a sense of feeling small, yet so large and part of something at the same time. So a lot of experiences that folks spoke to were more remote wilderness experiences, which is something that I often hear when I ask this question. Another key theme that really emerged was connection with others as well, and really feeling a stronger sense of connection and community with important others, family members, significant others. And not to mention just some really epic experiences. And folks alluded to or explicitly mentioned some of their experiences and expertise as well along the way, like wilderness field guides, instructors. So I feel really humbled by some of the members in the audience who are here, and again, just really thrilled to be able to talk about some of this stuff. As I was really reflecting about sort of prepping the past few days for this, what came up for me was an experience this past weekend that prompted some thought kind of around this, and in particular, sort of the experiencing that I'm framing for some of, or for my own kids. So this past weekend, I was at a local pond here in Bend with my kids, and as someone who is sort of a self-proclaimed sort of fisher person, you know, somebody who likes to go fishing, I really would love to get my kids connected, not necessarily with fishing itself, but at least with nature activity as a pathway to nature connection. So anyway, we were at this pond for about an hour, and we were at a location in the pond where really there weren't very many fish, and it was very obvious that all the fish were kind of at one tiny little corner of the pond where there was a lot of people. So eventually we took our turn and we went to that part of the pond. And my kids by that point, so I have twins who are 4 going on 5, and then I have a 1-year-old going on 2 as well. So all 3 of them have their little Frozen and Frozen 2 poles, Moana pole, and they're like trying to fish. But by that point, I've kind of lost their attention with the fishing. So, and yet they're saying that they want to catch fish. So here I am, I'm really actively trying to get them connected and in touch, you know, with these fish. And so we're hooking some fish, and they're losing fish, and I'm getting a little flustered because I'm like, like you say you want to catch fish, but you know, we're missing fish. And so I'm very, very fixated on this goal of helping my kids catch fish. And in the meantime, there's more people kind of crowding in, and we're in COVID-19 time. So I'm like, oh, okay, like we need more space here. And there was this really kind family who was to our side, and they saw us hooking some fish, and they were asking some questions. And I recall being really fixated on, I want my kids to hook the fish. I want my kids, to be the ones, like, like here, we're going to leave soon. And eventually kind of my kids completely lost attention. And so I began engaging more with the family and sharing a little bit. And another kid, probably 10 or 11, ran up with some worms and was like, hey, you guys should use some of these worms. So anyway, but to me, the reason why this experience really jumped out at me, I think both as a counselor, as a researcher, but also I think just as a dad, is sort of what are the kinds of experience, or what are the kinds of behaviors that I'm modeling for my kids kind of around nature. And part of the talk today, what I'm really emphasizing on is how can you be intentional with your time spent in nature, and being purposeful with kind of balancing a focus on task versus process. So as you recall your own nature experiences, as you think forward to your nature immersions and various kinds of things, I just really invite you to kind of think about what kinds of areas of wellness, health and wellness, are you hoping to sort of tend to for yourself, and not only for yourself, but maybe for others as well. And I think that this is a key, time, in our sort of human development in terms of coming together, connecting. And I think nature serves as a significant pathway for community healing, for individual healing, particularly as we're also thinking about the Earth's health and wellness, just in and of itself, in terms of the climate crisis that we're in. So anyway, again, thank you for being here, and also thank you for participating in today's reflection prompt. And I hope that it kind of got your mind going in terms of where we're headed today in the conversation. So speaking of where we're headed, I'll share a bit about my background. I'll talk or mention just briefly some landmarks of the nature wellness movement. And granted, like I said, it's a tiny slice of the pie, because there's a lot of disciplines who are talking about the nature wellness movement. And then I'll start talking about EcoWellness, some of the research that's been conducted kind of around that model of counseling, dive into the Fishing for Wellness project and curriculum, and then hopefully get to just a few considerations for you to be thinking about just for yourself. And granted, I don't want you to be limited to my small mind when it comes to some of this work, but really to be thinking about what is most relevant for yourself and for your community. So my goal for today, I think I may have already alluded or mentioned this, is that through the exploration of some of the pieces that we're talking about, is for you to be able to identify some possible ways of deepening your own nature-based experiences, and including those that you may be sharing with others, whether they're people who are close to you or whether they're other people that you're meeting out on the trail, and being able to facilitate a sense of community for all folks who are out there with you. So just a bit about me. I'm from Eastern Washington State originally. I majored in biopsychology as an undergrad at Western Washington University. And a key part of me, and I think that a pretty big influence on my interests, is I was a fly fishing guide in Alaska during the summers during my undergrad. And beyond that, I went and pursued my master's and education specialist degrees in school counseling at the University of Florida, and then pursued my PhD in counseling at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I started at Cascades as an adjunct faculty member in December 2012, and then transitioned into a full-time faculty member in 2013. I'm also a counselor in private practice here in Bend. And so while you're certainly getting a researcher lens for me, I think predominantly from me today, I have a pretty big clinical bent to me. And so I really come at things quite a bit from that lens as well. I think certainly there can be a synergy, there can be complementary forces there, but I think also there's a tension there too in terms of what is statistically significant or is most salient from a research perspective, and ultimately what is most relevant from a clinical perspective. So anyway, I want to come back to the guiding in Alaska piece. That was, I think, one of the most impactful times in my life when I was able to kind of live up there during my summers. And at the second lodge I worked at, I would actually live on the river in a tent or a canopy, just depending on the river that we'd be living on. And they would fly guests out to us each day in float planes, and we would take them fishing for rainbow trout, Arctic char, or depending on the salmon run, a particular species of salmon. So each day we would get a fresh set of guests flying out to us from the main lodge. And over time, I just noticed patterns, and these are all anecdotal, by the way, these aren't research based. But the patterns I noticed were kind of three different categories of folks who would be walking off that airplane. The first category, and I think it was one of the more common categories, would be sort of an explore and conquer mentality, as far as I'm here to catch the biggest fish. So for example, I'm here to catch the biggest king salmon and to catch the most king salmon, and I'm going to kill the biggest king salmon that I can. So very goal driven, and in a way almost kind of exploitive in terms of the resource. And sure enough, if that person caught the biggest king salmon, they had the best day. And as you can imagine, if they didn't catch the biggest king salmon, or let's say they didn't catch any salmon at all that day, it ended up being a pretty sour, not so good day for that individual. Kind of the second category, or the second type, would often be the spouse in tow of that first one. Someone coming off the airplane who has fear, like if not terror, to be in the Alaskan Southwest Alaskan remote wilderness, where there's bears and all sorts of other creatures that are out there. And so this sense of avoidance, and even just the sense of wanting to kind of disappear. So huddled in the boat, not really interested in fishing per se. And then there was this third type, and I would say that this was a little less common, would be someone getting off the plane and being very, just kind of the first thing noticing, like, whoa, look at this beautiful kind of landscape. And look at the hills, look at the mountains, like look at the water, look at the color of the water. And someone who really seemed to kind of balance sort of the task or the goal of fishing with this process. And when I say process, I mean just taking in and being within the particular environment where we were at. And so what I would oftentimes notice is that this person really would seem to have their cup most full kind of out of these three different categories. And granted, I'm speaking in kind of exclusive language here, or all or nothing language. And I would almost put these things more on a continuum, or maybe on different dimensions, where folks would be maybe in the middle in some areas, and that kind of thing. But still, it really kind of got my mind thinking, and it got me excited as I was heading into my master's program at Florida to be thinking, I wonder if there are ways to bring nature into healing. I'd certainly heard of wilderness therapy, so more kind of remote kinds of experiences that have been around really for decades, predominantly for at-risk youth, adolescents, young adults. But I was really curious about bringing kind of nature into school counseling or into traditional agency counseling settings. So I launched into my master's degree, and I began kind of looking into kind of what was out there within sort of the nature wellness kind of movement, really broadly speaking. And eventually I'll get to kind of ecotherapy and getting into that realm. But here, my purpose or my focus in this slide is just to sort of highlight just a really kind of a drop in the bucket in terms of some landmarks that are there in terms of the nature wellness movement. So this is by no means comprehensive of the different pieces. But I'd say that in the 60s and 70s, there was this expanding sort of awareness of humans growing further and further away from their connection with the rest of nature, and or just the destruction of nature. And consequently, there was this interest or expanding interest in the health-oriented consequences of sort of this parting ways with natural environments within industrialized societies specifically. And so you saw concepts such as eco-psychology or biophilia starting to come into play. So biophilia was this concept developed in the 80s that one of the core assumptions of the biophilia hypothesis is that humans are nature. And so therefore we develop to be in connection and in relationship with the broader ecosystem or ecosystems that humans are part of. So therefore, when we experience a disconnection and or as we're moving more towards industrialization, that's going to have an adverse impact, of course, on nature or on non-human nature, but also humans as well. Also, a kind of I'd say a landmark book in the realm of eco-psychology, The Voice of the Earth by Theodore Roszak, really kind of put on the map eco-psychology in a broader national and international way, which in the broader eco-psychology movement, there's this assumption that there's this ecological unconscious that humans have. So the spiritual connection and affinity that we have with nature. And so now sort of the broader study of kind of human nature connection and kind of sort of the mutuality in terms of health falls into the category of eco-psychology. And of course, there's a number of different disciplines that really span into eco-psychology. And in my area, of course, is more of the counseling area. Another landmark study, or I should just say a landmark study that came out in the mid-'80s, really bringing attention in the scientific community, was looking at the effects of having a view of nature outside of one's hospital window versus a brick wall, and actually finding significant associations between less time to recover from gallbladder surgery for those who had a view of nature in comparison to those who viewed the brick wall. So that really sparked, again, an expanding sort of interest within academia to be studying the effects of nature on human health and wellness. Then in the 2000s, Richard Louv, a journalist, published Last Child in the Woods. And that really sparked this movement to be thinking about and considering the importance and sort of really highlighting, I guess, the decreased to the extent to which children are connecting with nature and or spending in time with nature for any number of different reasons. So I think that's initiated a number of different movements, developed the Children or the Child Nature Network, and some different kinds of things. And then studies like this one, where time in nature has been associated with reductions in ADHD symptomology in children. So for somebody like me, a counselor type, that really sparks my interest. That gets me really interested and excited to be like, whoa, like what is the capacity to bring this into traditional counseling settings in terms of bringing that human nature connection into that. So in the 2000s and into the 2010s, you saw this flood of nature wellness research, and to the point now in 2021 where it's hard for me to keep up with it all, because like I said, it's coming from so many different disciplines. But here are some examples. Contact or connection with nature positively contributes to many aspects of health and wellness. And so greater perceptions of life satisfactions and global measures of well-being, increased focus and concentration. So that's been a really interesting area of study, and in particular around a theory called attention restoration theory. So to where viewing nature landscapes, including nature images and or virtual reality experiences, have been shown to sort of regenerate attentional capacities within individuals and or enhance focus and concentration. So super interesting. Additionally, contributing to reductions in psychological and physiological stress. So viewing nature landscapes, being in the presence of nature, nature smells and aromas, nature sounds. So really super interesting. And when I say reducing psychophysiological stress, actually reducing activation of the sympathetic nervous system or fight or flight, and activating parasympathetic nervous response, or the rest and digest response within humans. Additionally, some studies demonstrating reduced negative thinking and or rumination, and in particular associated reduced activation in one area of the prefrontal cortex that's associated with rumination. So again, the counselor part of me gets really interested kind of about that part, because often counselors and therapists are focusing in on cognitive distortions or thinking errors that folks are making, and trying to help folks reduce that rumination and or shift cognitive errors that are occurring for folks in terms of their interpretation of stimuli in their everyday environment. A piece that gets me really excited and interested is around the social connectedness. So contact with nature and or immersion in green settings has been shown to positively impact the extent to which folks feel connected with one another, contributing to a sense of social cohesion in small groups, and in experimental settings, actually contributing to greater generosity in hypothetical situations. And then lastly, and probably the least surprising, and not to say lastly, the last one I'll mention here is enhanced spirituality, and or just the sense of spirituality that folks experience. So anyway, like I mentioned, I got really excited about this as a master's student. That was back around 2008, 2009. And so, but in looking at the literature, there simply wasn't a lot out there that was actually in the realm of counseling psychology, social work, clinical psychology. So that's when I really started diving more into this multidisciplinary literature that I'm citing here, to kind of say, well, hey, like, what can we do as counselors, or what's available to counselors? And there wasn't a lot outside of wilderness therapy per se, other than some textbooks or books that were kind of generally talking about, or specifically talking about kind of different approaches to what's called ecotherapy, because folks were getting eager and pretty excited to be bringing this nature connection into counseling. And to date, even in 2021, this was true back in 2010 when I began my doctorate, but it's still true now, 11 years later. There's been really minimal rigorous research that's been conducted in support of the ecotherapies. And I'll couch that more specifically to traditional counseling settings. So looking at, like, how does a counselor incorporate the human nature connection in a traditional 50-minute counseling setting, let's say here at the OSU Counseling Clinic? Or what does this look like for a school counselor in working with K-12 youth? So that's been really my interest area. I like this cartoon, but part of really kind of what the ecotherapy perspective and I think the broader eco-psychology movement has done, it's really been about reframing mental illness as well, which is really very much in alignment with the wellness philosophy of counseling. So rather than looking specifically at an individual and pathologizing and identifying an individual symptomology as the issue, it's looking at the broader issue and what's happening and going on, and addressing our connection to that broader issue. Okay, so that brings us to EcoWellness. So as a doctoral student, I was really interested in, like I said, bringing kind of the human nature connection into counseling. It didn't take long for me to realize that there actually wasn't really a lot written specifically in the counseling field and profession around nature-based counseling, ecotherapy, and particularly really lacking research in the area. And so counseling is this field that is supposedly distinguished from other helping professions by its focus on wellness. When I say wellness, I should have introduced this earlier, the integration of mind, body, and spirit, and or the assumption that all aspects of health are interconnected. So if one area of health, like physical health, is impacted, then something like mental health is also going to be impacted, and so on. So anyway, a couple of key wellness models in the field of counseling did not include EcoWellness, or sort of just this nature connection that was in there. So we developed this construct, or this idea of EcoWellness and boldly said that it was a missing link in the counseling wellness models, which I think it was, and it is. And so I think that's been the contribution in terms of EcoWellness in the counseling literature in particular. But we defined it as one sense of appreciation, respect for and awe of nature that contributes to this greater sense of connection with self, but also with nature and others in the broader community, and hopefully also contributing to a greater sense of wellness. At the time, I underwent this really rigorous kind of literature review and looking across disciplines, and I identified kind of these 7 tentative kind of dimensions around or 7 directions or pathways to how contact with nature might contribute to this idea of holistic wellness. And so I sought out to develop this model wherein counselors could use it as a foundation for intervention development and research in particular. And so I developed this research tool. I called it the Reese EcoWellness Inventory. So that was a little self-absorbed at the time, apparently. I'd rather just call it the EcoWellness Inventory, but it turns out once you name something, it's kind of hard to change it. But anyway, it's 61 items. It's a paper pencil assessment, or you can take it in the Qualtrics survey or SurveyMonkey or what have you. And it's answered on a 4-point Likert scale: strongly disagree to strongly agree. And I'm going to go through these 7 different dimensions right now. And as I'm going through this, I would just invite you to kind of think about your own kind of dimensions. I would imagine that this is probably a fairly eco-well bunch who's on today. Predominantly, I'd be curious about that. But still, I just invite you to kind of check in on these 7 different dimensions and any areas where maybe you feel like you're lower relative to others. So this first area is maybe a no-brainer: physical access. In order to experience any sense of wellness around nature, a person needs to have had at some point and/or at present physical access to nature to develop a connection and/or to experience the wellness or health benefits of accessing that nature. So example items are nature surrounds me in my daily life. I have hobbies that include nature. When I step outside, I hear sounds of nature. So this is just really getting at that immediate access to nature that a person may have. This next one, sensory access, is looking more at indirect access to nature and/or really keying in on the 5 senses. So sight, sound, smells, touches. There's an item I think that even says, "I touch plants." So it's kind of a funny item in terms of when you first come across it. And this is taking into consideration or bringing back, I mentioned a little bit about the virtual reality and/or just even looking at a nature mural and how there have been studies around that, nature sounds, as well as nature scents and aromas. So there's items on the inventory that kind of bring in the 5 different senses. This next one is nature connection. And so this is thinking more about sort of the emotional and/or cognitive attunement that an individual may have to nature. So this might include early experiences in nature, important relationships with others in nature, a current place that you feel connected with, even just the anticipation of being in nature, if that puts you in a good mood, growing up and having one favorite place in nature. So things to that effect within the connection dimension. This next one's kind of an interesting one, and I don't know why I called it protection, but that's the dimension name, and really this is getting at nature self-efficacy. So the extent to which an individual feels effective in navigating kind of their environment that's around them. So I'm able to identify plants that can cause me harm, or I'm open to trying nature activities that may be discomforting. So getting to a sense of I feel confident in and around nature. And that for me, something that clinically speaking has been important just in working with clients and getting a sense for their comfort level and or their desire to integrate eco-wellness into their wellness plans or their treatment goals to address broader issues such as anxiety, depression, or other kinds of disorders that are popping up. This next piece, preservation or environmental agency, feeling like one can make a difference, and or looking at actual behaviors such as picking up litter on the ground if they see it. Granted, I know that may be a little bit different in COVID times or depending on your location. But then also just looking at the values too. So having a positive impact on the health of the planet is important to me. And so this is really looking at studies where they've looked at environmental friendly behaviors or actions and how that promotes and or contributes to perceptions of well-being. This next one, again, this tends to be kind of another no-brainer one for folks in terms of just feeling connected with something bigger than themselves. That's something that you often hear cross-culturally or see in the literature cross-culturally. So whether it's higher power, going to nature to find peace, but that transcendent experience of connecting with something bigger or outside of oneself. That brings us also into this community connectedness piece and that literature that I mentioned earlier around social cohesion. And or being more caring for others in and around natural environment. So that's what community connectedness gets at. So here are some example items. I feel a sense of community with others when in nature. When I'm in nature, I find myself thinking about others in my life. This one's a really interesting one because when I think about Western culture, I know it's a really general statement, I think about individualism. And sometimes when I think about definitions of nature amongst white middle class folks, I often hear conceptions around being out in nature, being in wilderness, being in solitude. And so the sense of community connectedness, feeling more connected with others in nature, I really like that emphasis within the model because it broadens our thinking to be more culturally, I think, inclusive and also sustaining in terms of thinking about how nature actually brings people together, and empirically it's been demonstrated to do that. So I want to talk just briefly about some key survey findings thus far on my EcoWellness adventures with using the EcoWellness inventory. So this first piece is that the REI, or the Reese EcoWellness inventory, it's a valid and reliable assessment. So the dimensions are actually pretty strong. The items stick together pretty well. Found that through exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis, and I'll mention more about the dimensionality here in just a moment, with an exciting new area that we're kind of going into and looking at the assessment. But the next piece is that it's strongly associated with overall wellness. So there's a measure of wellness in our field called the 5-factor wellness inventory. It operationalizes the indivisible self model of wellness developed by Myers and Sweeney back in the 90s. So it's a really well-used assessment. But in particular, and what was really interesting to me as key findings from the study was that feeling effective, or that protection factor in or with nature, and then having a sense of feeling like you can make a difference on the environment, or having a sense of environmental agency. It seems to have the greatest effects, in particular on a person's ability to work through challenging events, or kind of this coping self. Also inspire creativity, which is in alignment with sort of another body of research that looks at creativity and nature contact, and then also maintain physical health. So to me, that was really interesting. And actually in one of so we utilized a multivariate analysis with that. And in one of what's called the discriminant functions, the primary function that we interpreted, there was this really strong kind of connection between just about every aspect of eco-wellness and just about every aspect of holistic wellness. And so that to me was really interesting. This next piece here, in one sample, what we looked at was just sort of in adults, were there any biological sex differences and or differences across generations, generational status, or interactions between the two. Kind of overall, what we found is that older generations tended to be eco-well, younger generations tended to be less eco-well. Females, biological females, tended to be more eco-well. Biological males tended to be less eco-well. And here, what I'm describing are just some nuances kind of around some of those shifts, or how they kind of differed based on generational status. But still, it was interesting. It's kind of interesting looking at, and also in alignment with prior research. In particular, prior research suggesting that gender or female identifying individuals tend to be more connected with nature, as well as older generations. This next study I'll briefly mention is around mindfulness. So mindfulness, and I'll talk about mindfulness later and talking about fishing for wellness. You'd almost think about it, if you're not familiar with the term, is paying attention on purpose in the present moment and doing so without judging, which is actually, turns out, is kind of difficult to do. But anyway, we looked at mindfulness and aspects of personality and how they're associated with our measure of EcoWellness. And what we found is that those who tend to be more mindful and those who tend to be more extroverted, agreeable, and open, they tend to be more eco-well. And also we threw in this interesting measure around naturalness. Naturalness looks at the degree to which an individual believes something is natural. And so we had items around like looking at a picture of nature on your wall or on a TV screen versus wilderness setting. So a person who had a more kind of flexible definition of what nature was for them, they also tended to be more eco-well. So that has some interesting clinical implications as well. These next two pieces are just kind of areas that we're headed in now. So we have a manuscript in process right now where we're looking at connections between eco-wellness, resilience, self-efficacy, and self-esteem. And so tentatively, strong associations between all of these concepts and constructs. And then lastly, I mentioned this just in talking about sort of the reliability and validity of the eco-wellness inventory. There's really some research kind of across our samples that is pointing to some issues in terms of the replicability of the factor structure, of the 7-factor structure. And it's actually pointing to a much tighter factor structure around the dimensions of preservation, or that environmental agency, community connectedness, and spirituality. So I think that's going to open up kind of another exciting line of research to be looking specifically at 15 items on the inventory, and makes for a much more doable research process too when you don't have a 61 item inventory. But anyway, we'll see where that goes. I didn't know what to call this slide, so I called it a transition slide, because to me, what's been exciting and fun about the EcoWellness survey research I've done is it's identified this gap in our counseling literature to look at nature connection at all. However, you know, when people, when they think about me as a counselor, they ask me the research I do, they think that I'm doing clinical research, and they're surprised and like, what, like, why are you doing survey research? It's like, well, we needed to create sort of a foundation of how eco-wellness is possibly and hypothetically related to similar constructs or ideas or concepts. And so really we've been doing that. And the primary goal of developing the model was to aid counselors in the development of different counseling interventions. And so after some of this initial survey research, in the past few years, we began exploring our first application, the Fishing for Wellness group counseling protocol. And so that's what I'm going to be talking a little bit about here in our last, or I guess in the last half of the presentation here. So the Fishing for Wellness program, it's grounded on principles of mindfulness. So again, that paying attention on purpose and doing so without judgment, eco-wellness, and then fly casting. You know, I imagine we have fly fisher persons here you know, who are present here today. You know, but and for whether you have fly fished or whether you haven't, or regardless of your level of experience, what I love about fly fishing is it brings up anxiety and stress for just about everybody, especially in the presence of others. So it brings about this really amazing way to bring you into the here and now experience, to where you can see how people are responding, and it allows you to work with a person's presenting challenges or problems in the here and now space, in the support of the group environment as well. We didn't develop the curriculum to be a standalone individual counseling intervention, but rather more as an in addition to individual counseling to be done within the group counseling context. And also here, what I wanted to mention is the context for development as well. And I think that this is sort of I'd say a strand of my research and interest is looking at developing interventions, nature-based interventions for clients who are potentially less amenable or less open to traditional counseling services, and particularly for individuals who are presenting with complex relational trauma. And so, folks with trauma histories that range from child abuse and neglect, exposure to extreme loss, death of loved ones, lack of parents or important others, lack of stability and consistency. Individuals who are much less likely to seek out traditional counseling services. How can we be developing interventions for those folks? And there was a meta-synthesis here in the past year, looking at sort of these kind of ecotherapy and client experiences. And a predominant theme was that clients seek out ecotherapy because it's not traditional counseling. They don't want to meet inside the four walls. And so it's not that people are necessarily looking specifically for nature-based counseling or ecotherapy, but they don't want those traditional experiences. So that was also kind of an additional lens that we were looking at in developing this Fishing for Wellness curriculum, is how can we really cater to individuals and folks who may be less likely to seek out traditional counseling. So the format of the group, it ranges between 6 to 8 weeks. And so that would be one time per week. And these are around 2-hour sessions. So there are 6 to 8 meetings, just depending on the logistics and the time frames. But that's where we just have some flexibility built within the curriculum. How we've done it, we've actually done pretty big groups, anywhere in the size. I guess we've done it as small as 8, but as large as 16. So pretty big. So for a group, because really in an ideal world, your counseling group is more like 6 to 8. Individuals. In this case, it's really important to have 2 counseling facilitators or 2 credentialed persons to be able to co-facilitate that big of a group. It's a big group. But anyway, the weekly group structure includes a large group check-in or activity, followed by an overview of the specific content that's going to be covered for that particular day. And a primary goal here is to help facilitate group cohesion, to help develop a sense of trust between and amongst group members, and also with the facilitators as well, because they're really exposing themselves in the sense of like fly casting. Like, you're opening up your body and you're casting, people are watching. That's a vulnerable activity, particularly if when we're thinking about individuals coming from more of a traumatic background or place. So that trust and that cohesion is imperative. So after that initial activity and kind of the overview of whether it's mindfulness content or EcoWellness content that's covered, it then splits into smaller groups where then the groups really dive into specific fly casting, mindfulness skills or EcoWellness skills, where those skills are actually practiced. And then near the end of each group, that experience is processed within the small group, each small group, and then coming back together to where sort of the groups kind of talk about sort of, all right, like, so what happened? What did we learn from that? And then kind of what is the now what in terms of how do we apply this this week to your life and outside of the group? I've already mentioned some of these elements in the prior slide, but I just wanted to emphasize that this group, it blends together kind of this idea of psychoeducation. So we're teaching people about mindfulness. As part of mindfulness, we're teaching people about cognitive behavioral therapy or an application of cognitive behavioral therapy. And in particular, talking about thinking errors, and how we interpret reality or our body's signals. And how can we apply mindfulness to slow down our thinking to reinterpret the reality of the situation. So just because my body's reacting and I feel stressed in the moment, it doesn't mean that I'm actually in harm's way. We're actually able to slow down. So anyway, there's a psychoed element within the program, and also group counseling, where I mentioned kind of the group support, where people are coming and they're talking about real life problems, what's happening for them. and getting feedback from one another, actual conflict that emerges and happens within the group, which is normal within counseling groups, as the weeks kind of move on to get more to a working phase. The structure of the group allows for skills to be learned and applied over time, and where the concepts from the weeks before are built upon in terms of both the fly casting as well as the eco-wellness and the mindfulness. And then everything culminates into this half-day fishing excursion. At least so far in our program, that's what it's been. It's more of a half-day kind of experience where we do a picnic and where folks are really applying their skills and heading out, whether it's in their small group experiences or they head out in pairs or even in solitude, depending on the individual. So just to kind of, I know I don't have a video of this, I don't have pictures because of privacy and confidentiality, but I at least just wanted to give kind of an overview or an example of what this looks like. So imagine you're coming to the second session. People are bringing their own kind of lawn chairs or camping chairs or sitting on the grass. We're meeting at a nearby park that has a river that's right by it. And at the beginning of this session, we're just checking back in on, hey, we met last week. That was the first time meeting. What came up for folks? And then we jump into this overview of mindfulness. So this part of so session 2 is where we really jump into mindfulness. And in particular, we emphasize this idea of beginner's mind, which within mindfulness, it's that paying attention on purpose without judgment, but also really looking at something as though you've never seen that before. And you're being absolutely curious about that. So anyway, giving some psychoeducation around the beginner's mind concept, clarifying, seeking understanding about that for folks. We then have people set out on a solo activity. Certainly if individuals want to go paired together, they can be paired together. But participants are instructed to go and find an object within nature and apply the beginner's mind concept. We then come back together and we process that as a big group. We then, from there, break into our small groups. And there's a facilitator that's assigned to each small group. And within these small groups, we have all the fly rods within the program, and folks get out their fly rod for the first time. So some folks, they've done this before, others haven't. We don't really give very many instructions other than go ahead and put your fly rods together. And just sort of naturally, people are putting things together, maybe asking one of the facilitators, hey, where does this one go? How does this work? They're stringing up the rods and they're beginning to cast their poles for the first time. And so the whole time we're really just inviting them to have the beginner's mind, to be open, to be curious. And here we're just having, when we're processing the activity, we're inviting them to share about what it was like to do this, what it was like to do this in the presence of other people, what came up for them. Excitement and anxiety are two really common ones. Then just kind of really kind of finding common ground and really building that cohesion within the small group, starting right there in session 2. And it certainly started in session 1, but this is where we dive in, I'd say much more. Following the small groups, we're coming back together as the big group. So that's kind of the 2-hour structure, what this looks like between sessions 1 up until around session 6 or so, or 7, depending on when we do the half-day outing. So here are the rules, and I'm curious, if maybe you can check in on how you would do with some of these rules. So the first, to be with and to notice nature. The second one, there is no right or wrong way to fly cast. I imagine some of you out there might disagree with that. There's an invitation to just notice your mind, feelings, and body when you fly cast, and how these things are connected, and really working toward non-judgment, being aware of the judgment when it comes up. Accepting your natural way of fly casting and being open to new ways of casting. And if you evaluate your casting, just noticing the self-judgment. So as you can see here with this, is it's all kind of couched through mindfulness, a mindfulness perspective, but all within the natural environment. And all along the way, we're inviting folks to consider their own connection with nature, their own physical access to nature, sensory access, spirituality, the extent to which they feel connected to one another and or others outside of the group. So we engage in a qualitative evaluation of this program here about 2 years back. And so to me, this has a long ways to go in terms of looking at further validity of the Fishing for Wellness program. But I wanted to share just briefly a little bit about the research that we did here. And out of the many outcomes that there were, just 2 outcomes, just really briefly kind of touch on those before wrapping up here in the next few minutes. So that group, I think it was the big group that I mentioned. We had 16. I think ultimately there were 12 participants who engaged in semi-structured qualitative interviews. So they didn't fill out quantitative assessments, but rather we opted to do qualitative interviews to really kind of honor folks in their stories and their experiences, and to really kind of start in that way. All folks were recruited from a partner organization here in town that I've developed a relationship with over the past 6 or 7 years. And we were curious to know what were participant experiences and perceptions of the Fishing for Wellness curriculum, and if personal growth happened, just sort of what were some of the benefits. And then the second piece, what contributed to those benefits from their perspectives. For those of you interested in the more qualitative sort of data analysis process, here's just a little bit there. We used a consensual qualitative research methodology, which took a really long time to get through the data. Our analysis process took about 5 months as a team of 5 members, which also included an external methods consultant, as well as an external auditor. So in total, there were 7 of us. Lots of validation checks or trustworthiness checks along the way, included monitoring our own self-bias through what's called bracketing, and talking about that as a team and as a group. So anyway, this is for those of you who are more interested in kind of the methodology realm. This slide is there for you. So I want to talk about just, again, 2 outcomes. I'm not going to dive too far into the details, but a couple of the client change pieces that came up for clients. We did these semi-structured interviews about 2 to 3, depending on the participant, about 2.5 to 3 months following the experiences. And we did that on purpose because we were really curious to see what had or hadn't changed, what were pieces that might have changed, but then went back to normal for folks. So the first one was that folks described this greater self-kindness or compassion following the curriculum. So for me, I kind of took that as, okay, a lot of the mindfulness aspects of the curriculum really kind of stuck. It made me also wonder about sort of the impacts of the group and the support and the facilitators within the context of the group. But also participants reported significant shifts in nature relatedness and also time spent in the 2 to 3 months following the actual intervention. This also included individuals with really adverse nature experiences. And when I say adverse, I mean homelessness and or significant substance use and abuse that occurred outdoors. And so this was for a number of our participants. And so that was I think a really profound shift for a number of our participants. Here's just a couple of participant quotes. So for this individual, it's helped me getting back out there to see that when I was out there, that I was really lucky that I was in such a beautiful place. I've gone from, well, I had to live in a tent and it really sucked, to, yeah, I got to live in a tent and it sucked, but also look at the views that I had. I can look at the pictures of Roberts Rock and I'm going to think, I got to wake up every morning to see that. I do have a new appreciation for being outside and things like that. Another person went on to say, Sunday I went to Oaken Park and just laid out in the park. Normally I wouldn't do that. I would have come home and been like, I can do that in my backyard. I've been sitting outside more. Like yesterday, instead of getting a ride from my job to an errand I had to run, I walked. So yeah, I would say that it helped me to be outside more. Kind of the outcome too. So what were some of the potential kind of facilitative components that helped contribute to change for folks? So the directed experiences in nature, including those that integrated mindfulness concepts as well as fly fishing activities, tended to be the most impactful of the nature-associated interventions that folks mentioned or recalled or talked about as contributing to some of the shifts that they self-reported. Next, this facilitator modeling was mentioned by a number of folks, whether it was emotional stability, modeling what connection to nature looks like, or having a passion for nature, as well as the fly fishing skills that were there and present for folks. Next, this balance between activities, so solo activities, community activities, the nature-based activities where folks are just kind of immersing themselves in nature versus having fly rod in hand, kind of this diversity really seemed to invite, and also really being able to have a choice. Folks had a choice to the extent to which they would participate. Really, that autonomy seemed to be empowering for folks. So just a few comments here. So this first comment is relative to the first session in coming up with group norms, which is actually pretty common across counseling groups. We all got to put up our own guidelines and rules for how we wanted the group to be ran. And we all got to speak into that. The rules weren't implemented on us. We got to come up with them ourselves. So having that sense of agency and choice and how they got to interact and how they got to navigate within the natural environment and also with each other was important. The second comment is about the facilitators. Their love of being outside was really the big part for me. When you have that resistance to it, I think it was important for me to see other people's views of what it meant to them. So for this particular participant, there was a resistance to the curriculum and participating within it. And seeing the facilitators as well as for other group participants for this person, it helped them kind of work through some of that initial resistance. This third one is actually looking at the session 2, I think, for the activity. It might have been a different one, but I think that they're probably speaking to the session 2 activity that I mentioned here a few moments ago. One class I remember, they told us to go out and find something to look at. So I found a rose and it had this whole colony of little bugs on it. So I took a picture with my phone really close up and I caught all the little bugs that were on the roads. It was like there was this little city on this rose. So it opened up a whole little vision of an entire city there. So I'm going to share a couple of counseling implications, pieces that I feel like are relevant to my field. I think first, specifically, a program like Fishing for Wellness can be healing for people who have experienced prior adversity in and around nature. Up front, a number of folks described a lot of hesitance for participating with one another. What I didn't go into was a theme around gender. So we had a mixed gender group and a number of individuals reported abuse, sexual abuse, physical, domestic violence of individuals of the opposing gender. So this was quite the risky thing for them to be doing in terms of sort of that, how their bodies were reacting to being present with the opposing, with the other gender that was present. And so to me, it was really significant that this group kind of, it had people keep coming back. We didn't have a lot of people drop from the group. And that also individuals who had adverse experiences within nature, such again as homelessness, can be reframed or even reinterpreted. Not to say that the sour or terrible experiences are changed, but rather there were elements that maybe they didn't see before that could contribute to the person's growth process. So that was significant. This next one is that fly fishing really seemed to serve as a primary kind of pathway for wellness and contact for the intervention for some folks, whereas it seemed less important for others. So it makes me think about the applicability of a program like Fishing for Wellness, but putting in its place, whether it's hiking, biking, rock climbing, picnicking. I don't know what it would be, but maybe it depends on the geographic location and or the community. So maybe fly fishing could be replaced with other kinds of interventions or other kinds of nature-based activities, I mean. The second implication I want to talk about briefly here is coming back to the group cohesion, coming back to that gender piece that I mentioned. Like, I think nature served as a significant co-facilitator. Nature was the go-between that connected group members together. And that really, I think, is re-emphasizing literature that's already out there that really demonstrates that nature can contribute to group cohesion, connectedness with others, and also the generosity piece that I mentioned. And this is our last slide here. So I've talked a lot about kind of my world in terms of counseling and some implications for the work that I do and the work that I'm interested in. I hope along the way that maybe there were some pieces here for you too that maybe you feel like are applicable to you. Uh, and here are some thoughts or ponderings that I had about it. So, or some encouragement. I would encourage us to really kind of just slow down and notice our nearby nature surroundings. They don't necessarily have to be these wilderness experiences. I go back to that mindfulness and naturalness study that we did. Um, Individuals who had a broader definition of what nature was tended to be more eco-well. And so I think sometimes we can take for granted, for those of us that have the privilege of having safe access to nearby natural spaces, to maybe not notice or to be on autopilot. So I think even more importantly, paired with directed mindfulness activity, slowing down, noticing our breath, noticing the color, the textures, like I think that can be really helpful for reducing stress in particular, and integrating that throughout our days. So just noticing that nature, whether you're at your workplace, whether you're at home, whether you're in the car, whether you're on your bike. Second, if you did know any areas of eco-wellness that were maybe lower tonight, maybe find ways to address them. Maybe the next time that you're out, maybe just kind of check in about that, with yourself. I find that for many right now, particularly in the climate crisis, there's a sense of overwhelm. There's a sense of whatever I do is going to be a drop in the bucket. That I don't know whether or not it's just a drop in the bucket. But I certainly can think of ways that folks can engage in that environmental agency. And that's one that I see folks oftentimes report being lower in. The third one, this is I think getting back to what I mentioned kind of with kind of the nature types when I was guiding in Alaska and noticing that, and something that really seemed to come out in the Fishing for Wellness group as well, is just being able to blend active goal-directed nature recreation with moments of reflective activities or just being. I think there are some nature-based activities that are maybe more conducive to that. But I would really challenge us, those of us who may be really avid mountain bike riders or road bikers or snowboarders or downhill skiers or whatever, like really active sports, to find those opportunities to slow down and to just be, just to notice. In addition to, being in that flow state and really getting what you're getting out of those high intensity nature-based activities. And then lastly, and this is going back to the example I shared, with me and my kids this past weekend, but on outings where there's the opportunity for social contact and connection, or maybe you're with others in your own group, just letting that nature be your go-between, and prioritizing kind of those here and now experiences and sense of awareness, and those relationships over the activity itself. So when I go back to my own experience this past weekend, I think, and I wonder, not that I'm regretting or shaming myself over it, it's kind of a silly example, but just I wonder what it could have been like to connect with that family sooner, and to share a little bit more knowledge and expertise, and how that might have been connecting, and or to follow my kids and to do more of what they were doing than being so focused in on the activity of fishing. But anyway, thank you, folks. I want to acknowledge just very briefly my fellow collaborators and students that I work with across a number of different projects. And by all means, not everyone is mentioned here, but I couldn't do this work without my collaborators. And granted, this is a small slice of the pie, and this is, I feel very grateful and privileged that I'm able to contribute in the ways that I am within the eco-wellness realm. So with that, I think, Nathan, I need to stop sharing my screen, yes?
Yep, that's perfect.
Excellent.
Excellent. Well, Ryan, thank you so much. That was great. I think if anything else, I mean, clearly lots of new stuff that I learned, but I think just some reminders, because as much as my kids, even in school, having twins myself, we share that. I'd forgotten that we had that link. They're learning about mindfulness being in third and fourth and fifth grade. And I think as an adult, I wish I would have had more time in that in my developing years, because have to put those brakes on sometimes and just be. So I really appreciate that tonight. Everybody that is in here, again, hope you all enjoyed the presentation. What we'd like to do now is we'll pull up the Mentimeter screen again as a reminder to get signed in tonight. We definitely have some questions that have already started coming in. But again, you're going to go to that menti.com app with the code 86920470. Again, 86920470. Pop a question to us. Please, it can be short, long, personal experience, whatever you'd like it to be, because we'll give some content for Ryan tonight before we conclude tonight's show to get some perspective. So I'll let you all start putting that in. And Ryan, I guess we'll start getting right to it. Oh, I will say, folks, everybody, I forgot, as Jill did in chat for the YouTube channel itself, please feel free, if you don't want to use Mentimeter, feel free to drop a question in chat for the YouTube event as well. So we will get started. So the first question that came in, and because of my knowledge a little bit of autism spectrum, I think I understand where this is coming from. You had mentioned for some of the research, that initial focus on concentration, the restoration therapy thing, I think you talked a little bit about, and that reducing the activation of fight and flight. I think maybe this is where this question is coming from. Is there any specific research in how folks on the autism spectrum potentially benefit from an outdoor-based program like what you presented on tonight? And is there a difference maybe in young children and its effectiveness versus adults?
It's a great question. I think my first response would be, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with research looking at eco-wellness based or nature-based interventions, specifically with individuals on the spectrum. Again, it's not to say that it's not out there, right? I just am not familiar with it. But the second part of the question, I feel like I can speak to a little bit more in terms of sort of the excitement and the shifts. Well, from my perspective, it's excitement for engaging children with nature, and how it has a much more, or it can have a much more non-directive feel to it. And I think the key for adults, or for myself, as I'm thinking about it for myself in both my work with clients and also with my own kids, is thinking about the limits that are set and the safety parameters that are set. But outside of that, allowing our kids to experience natural consequences. So, certainly maybe they're not climbing a 50-foot tree or 100-foot tree, but if they're climbing up into a 5-foot tree, or depending on how high you're letting them go up, maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay if they fall out of the tree and they learn from that experience. There are some researchers who are looking at risky play, including researchers at OSU-Cascades, who are looking at sort of the importance of play on childhood development in particular. So for me, when I think about the differences for what this might look like with children versus adults, I can't imagine very many children, let alone adolescents, maybe some adolescents, young adults, going through the Fishing for Wellness curriculum, but definitely not children. So you'd be looking at adapting this and having it be much more non-directive. There's another interesting approach developed by my colleague, Jacqueline Swank at the University of Florida. And it's called nature-based, non-directive, child-centered play therapy. It's a really long name.
It's a mouthful. That's cool. Excellent. Another question that came in through one of the YouTube chats from Jill. So thank you, Jill. She belongs to Mazamas. Hopefully I'm saying that correctly because I'm new to the program, in Portland, Mountain Bike Education Club. Big issue this year, being more welcoming to persons of color and the LGBTQIA+ communities. The outdoors can be a refuge, which I know that you had talked about, a lot in some of the work that you've done. But unfortunately, because of some unwelcoming people, it can also be really threatening to some groups of folks. Any perspective on that on your end, and maybe some of the research you've done, but then also anything you've kind of experienced or seen for yourself this last year?
Yeah. I think that's incredibly, I think it's really important, and part of the challenge and a significant limitation of my research, the survey research that I've done, it's probably predominantly been with white folks, with very few persons of color or representing the BIPOC community. And so I think I want to share that. And I think the next piece kind of around that too is something you'll see in the national parks literature, and I'm by far less familiar with it, is looking at to the extent to which BIPOC individuals feel welcome within national parks or U.S. Forest Service land, And it's an overwhelming, I think there's an overwhelming sentiment or feeling that persons of color do not feel welcome. And in large part too, some of what's been reported is that the trails, and I'm thinking specifically about, Pacific Northwest trails. And so if there are folks on the here right now who are outside of the Northwest, that's my context and frame of reference. But I'm thinking about how a lot of park lands are conducive to solitude experiences and or individual experiences or small group experiences, which is potentially culturally incongruent or non-responsive to many communities. So that to me is a significant, I think, an important conversation, to be had. And there are really important groups that have developed and they've been present. So Afro Outdoors and Latino Outdoors are a few to mention, just to increase visibility and to say, hey, it's not just this white middle class REI version, of what it looks like to go outdoors, because that's been the predominant dominant narrative, I should say, that's been out there about what it means or what it looks like to connect in nature. There's some picture of, some white male who's standing on a mountaintop, and so I think through that advocacy and through what you're mentioning, I think that's paramount, and I think that's pivotal, and I think that's where I think the conversation needs to go.
Yeah, and Jill, just kind of chime back in there too. If nature contributes to wellness, barriers to nature are barriers to wellness. So I think that's kind of a profound thing of why this is such an important topic in this field to really start, digging deeper into. Excellent. Jill, thank you for that. Other questions coming in through Minty. Let's see. Oh, Ryan, any experience with treating chronic pain through maybe some of your method? And I'm thinking the commenters may be thinking around the fly fishing realm and kind of being there, being in that place, being there in the moment. Any applications for that?
I think so. I think, when I think about several group members, the multiple times I've done this group who have reported chronic pain, in particular. So unfortunately, the fishing component is something that can absolutely sort of flare things up for folks, especially around nerve pain and or just other muscular skeletal issues. So I think it's for that reason, it's incredibly important to adapt the experience, the importance of not shaming participants and really setting a tone within the group to empower individuals to make the choices they want to make for themselves and they need to, and also ensuring that the places that you're meeting are going to be accessible. I think that's been a key component of our program as well, and important lessons that we've learned along the way in terms of getting feedback from participants. So in terms of the actual, pain reduction possibilities or shifting pain, that's where the mindfulness literature comes into play, particularly around a paradigm called mindfulness-based stress reduction, or MBSR. At this point, I think there's been hundreds of studies in support of it, and the Fishing for Wellness curriculum borrows its structure in large part kind of through the MBSR program in terms of how it's framed, at least the psychoeducational components of it. And so there's literature looking at mindfulness applications and how it can shift perceptions of pain. But as far as the Fishing for Wellness curriculum and or kind of the nature piece in particular, I'm not quite as familiar, with literature kind of around that. But again, just going back to sort of the links between mindfulness and nature connection, I would think that an implication would be possible that, the possible interventions that could be there and present for folks in terms of an ancillary or alternative way to address pain reduction, depending on an individual's presenting problems.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much for that. I'm going to kind of overgeneralize this question, but I'm familiar. Sage is a company that's I'm not a fly fisher, Ryan. I'm sorry, man. It looks awesome. I have not done it yet. I'm still relatively new to Oregon. But are there public-private partnerships around some of the research, and maybe specifically in your field, and some of your projects, like with this fly fishing piece, or maybe other projects that are going where I guess the private entities or the corporations are kind of seeing like, hey, the mindfulness, the wellness component of what we're providing the public is a neat little overlap. Anything like that currently going on?
So Nathan, is it around partnerships that we have with the program, or?
Yeah, I mean, and specifically, I think this question was specifically pointing Sage out as like, hey, is Sage a part of
Oh, gotcha.
the program, or are there other things that you're exploring? Or
Yeah, they're so not Sage itself. It's Farbank Enterprises. So they gave us really significant discounts on their what products did we get? It wasn't Sage. We Reddington. So they also own Reddington. So Reddington was a significant contributor for fly rods, as well as Temple Fork Outfitters. And so it was kind of through those entities that we were able to purchase a ton of fly rods and to have those around for when we offer the program for folks. So yeah, so that's been significant. I think that for, there are, I think, some other programs that are out there, Project Healing Waters, for example, and there are several other programs specifically that work with veterans that are less counseling focused, but definitely very wellness focused, that tend to get that bigger kind of spotlight that out there in the media. So I'd say fishing for wellness is definitely a more kind of up and coming piece. At least I hope it is. Well, who knows whether it's really up and coming or not, but
well, you're making me want to get out there, man.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, it's a great question, and we've definitely benefited from having some partners who are willing to support us. So
cool. Excellent. Are there, apply to any of this construct to other outdoor activities involving specific skill development? So I guess I'm translating this, that fly fishing skill development, that's definitely a learned thing for people, but there's not one right way to do it, as you said. But are there some other things currently that some of your research is being used for other skill development?
So there's a colleague of mine who's just finishing up their doctorate at Arkansas, and they're not taking this model for kind of exactly as it is, but they're looking at it through a mountain biking lens, and in particular helping students learn how to mountain bike as part of a wellness curriculum. And they have aspects of kind of EcoWellness kind of sprinkled throughout their curriculum, but it's a different program. And I think, to me, there's just so much that's why one of my interpretations, or our team's interpretations of our findings from the study, was fly fishing was important to some, but really you could kind of put any other nature activity in there, it seems like. Because at the end of the day, this really wasn't about learning fly fishing. This was about learning wellness skills and how to really feel more effective and confident in navigating the natural environment, which was really exciting to hear how participants were navigating the environment more and or feeling more connected to it, and also engaging in mindfulness more. So not that my research team is doing, but I think other folks are doing some really interesting things.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Any difference in the effectiveness on city dwellers versus small town clients?
Ooh, that's interesting. Because it would, when I think about small town, I think more about, let's say, rural. I don't know if that's where the person is coming from with their question. But I do wonder about sort of so if a person, let's say they're living in Bend, Oregon, and they live on a river, let's say, or they have a view of the mountains or something like that, on some level, the novelty of that goes away. On some level, a person's nervous system sort of accustoms to that environment. At least that's an assumption I'm making. So whereas for an individual coming from, let's say, an urban environment and having that, same view or experience, sees that view for the first time and is like, oh my gosh, that's going to affect them in a different kind of way. So person in small town and or really, let's say nature immersed, let's say, I think that's where just varying nature experiences are going to have varying effects on different folks. I would imagine, for any number of different reasons. At least that would be my assumption from a clinical kind of perspective. And so that's where I really come at it more from an individual sort of perspective. And so for me, when, like being in Bend and working with clients in Bend, where, folks, when I ask them about nature connection, they're talking about getting up into the sisters wilderness or wherever, and they're not even really thinking about always sort of the nature that's right here, in terms of the river that's here, in terms of our plentiful parks, and or the nature that's just right outside many of our front doors. Not everybody, but so for me, I really try to get an individual sense of that. But coming back to the research, I think that maybe was where the question was coming from. I'm not as familiar with research comparing individuals urban versus more kind of rural environments.
That's great. Yeah, it does make me think about that too. And I don't know. I don't hope I never lose that, Ryan. But it's like I'm like 5 minutes away from Shevlin Park here in Bend, and that is my refuge. So I like to think that hopefully people don't get too desensitized to it. But I definitely understand what you're saying. I think growing up in a small town, it makes total sense.
And that to me is where the beginner's mind comes into play. Is really kind of just, how can I notice something new about it? What's new within this landscape? How do I not sort of take for granted, for the people that have the privilege to take that for granted, to really absorb it?
I think that's so key. So key. I mean, especially for us in Central Oregon here, because we have such fantastic things around us. And I mean, that's why people like coming to visit here, is for that first time experience. But it is pretty incredible when you just slow down and take a look at that new animal path that was created or diverted because of what happened over the course of the year, or, water flow. I mean, I love water. Water's my thing. But it's just amazing to just kind of sit back and relax and really be in that moment with it, like you're saying. Hey, we'll do one more question here to kind of round up for tonight. First of all, a lot of people saying, Ryan, great presentation. I agree, good presentation. One thing here is you mentioned climate change actually a little bit in your presentation. Do you see participants having a change of view of climate change as they spend more time in nature and appreciate its benefits? And I guess back to our point earlier, being more present in it.
I think this wasn't an outcome of the qualitative study that we did. But there was, I think, greater awareness about the impacts of fishing, and awareness. Part of the curriculum is actually talking about sort of, and part of what we do is we give everybody a trash bag and they pick up garbage, as long as it's safe to pick up. We also give people gloves and stuff too, we're not having them pick up anything unsafe, but there's an expanded awareness about the possibility of at least having a small positive impact on nature. And granted, it's like, well, wait a minute, you're having them like put hooks in the mouths of these fish. Like what is that doing? And fair point. And at the same time, there's sort of this broader appreciation for nature that we're really trying to instill, in a sense of, hey, I can do something. I can cast this rod. I can pick up garbage. So I think when it comes to something on the scale of climate change, I think we put it down into smaller chunks than climate change. I think that's certainly something that comes up. But my goal in my work with clients too is, to certainly address the existential angst and anxiety and threat that climate change is, and to honor that, to give space for it, but also what are smaller tangible things that a person can actually do in their life. And if there are bigger things that they can do too, then great, let's talk about that as well. But within the program itself, we really try to chunk it down into manageable steps that people can take to really become advocates on behalf of the environment. And yes, it is couched in this really human-centric way, because we're talking about human wellness within the context of the program, but it's definitely present.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And everybody, again, thank you for your contributions tonight, not only in your participation, but sending us your great responses. It was fun to read through some of those reflections from our registrants, but then also to participate with us at the end of the show with these great questions. So before we close out tonight, couple event reminders. We just wanted to go ahead and put back up as a reminder our next couple science pubs. Again, Bryson Robertson and his work on wave energy on May 10th. John Parmigiani is the individual that's going to be presenting on OSU's prototype development laboratory on May 25th. And then Matt Orr bringing gut ecosystems and relevance to human health on the evening of June 7th. So stay tuned for those registrations. For me, again, just thanks everyone for attending. Our edition of Central Oregon Regional OSU-Cascades Science Pub. Massive thank you to Ryan for his time and efforts for tonight's presentation, as well as participation with the Q&A. A lot of work goes into this, everybody. They do a lot of work in the field. They do a lot of work in the classroom, but putting together an hour presentation definitely takes some time. So big thanks to that. And as always, a special shout out to Connect Central Oregon for their production efforts. So that concludes our Science Pub for Tuesday, April 20th, 2021. Tell a friend about your experience. Definitely remember to shoot us topic ideas to events@osukascades.edu for things you'd like to see in the future. And we will look forward to you joining us out there next time. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great evening.